Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to give everybody just a few more minutes to get logged on, get set up. So just hang tight for another minute or two, and then we'll begin. Thank you. All right, I think we'll get started. So thank you for everyone who's joined today. You see our title there on the screen, Transparency Going Global. So we're going to be talking about um, some comparisons between the U.S. and outside the U.S., the reporting landscape. Just a few administrative things before we get underway. First of all, if you have any questions as we go through, we certainly welcome them. In the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side or the top, wherever you have it on your screen, there should be a little window, a little block where you can enter questions and send them to us. So if you have anything, certainly send us your questions. We'll take a look at the end, and depending on how much time we have, we'll try and answer a few. If we don't get to your question, we will absolutely follow up with you after the fact. Okay? Another thing just to keep in mind, we're happy to send the slides to you after the webinar. So again, if you would like the slides, you could put that in the question box or you could email Brian or I. And then similarly, we're actually recording this and we're going to be putting it on the Porzio LS website once we get it all saved and set up. So if you have friends or colleagues that couldn't join us today, but you think would be interested in hearing it, let us know, and we can either get to the file or point it to where it will be on our website. Okay? All right, so getting underway, this is Chrissy Bradshaw. I know many of you, I think we work with an awful lot of companies on the transparency side of things. I have been with Porzio for about 8 years. I'm an attorney, so do a little bit on the legal side and then work with a lot of companies on the actual reporting side of things with our aggregate spend tools, Porzio Aggregate Spend ID and Porzio GST. And with me is my colleague Brian.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, perhaps. My name is Brian Sharkey. I am also a vice president at Porzio Life Sciences, and like Chrissy, I'm also an attorney. And I spend a lot of my time focusing on a lot of the ex-US or OUS issues that we'll be talking about today, and working with companies as they try to understand, navigate, and comply with a lot of those OUS reporting requirements, which are starting to pick up more and more in different places around the world.
All right, and without further ado, all right. So the U.S., we're going to sort of go on a little journey here. As many of you know, we have been dealing with reporting, transparency reporting on the U.S. side for quite a while. At the state level, initially, actually way back to 1993, I believe, and then just a few years ago, the Affordable Care Act introduced, of course, the Sunshine Act, as we lovingly call it, and CMS put in place the Open Payments Program. So we have our national law here in the U.S., and then a handful of states that still have reporting requirements as well.
So looking outside the U.S., we're going to, on this slide, highlight a bunch of different places and a couple different industry groups where we're seeing transparency reporting requiremements. But for the most part today, what we're going to do, Chrissy and I, we're going to kind of ping pong back and forth about the U.S. reporting requirements as they compare to FPIA. And we're also going to highlight a few different nuances with respect to the medical device industry groups and maybe some other places around the world as we have time. But we thought it would be most effective to try to orient folks who are more familiar with the U.S. to do kind of a compare and contrast with the U.S. and FPIA. We have FPIA up here, up top there. That is the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. It's comprised of 33 different national member associations, so 33 different countries in Europe, and that includes Russia and Turkey and various other countries that are not necessarily members of the European Union. In addition to national member associations, there are also 40 full corporate members of FPIA, and that's important because the corporate members, the various pharmaceutical companies that are members of FPIA, are bound to comply with FPIA's various codes, including, most importantly for our conversation here today, FPIA's disclosure code, which it first adopted in 2013, revised in 2014. And in that disclosure code, which we're going to get into, the focus is really on individual level reporting for both healthcare professionals and healthcare organizations. So that's been a big focus on outside the U.S. FPIA has really been kind of leading the way in developing a self-regulatory measure because they did not like what was happening in the United States and what was happening in a couple other European countries, which will pop up in a second, in terms of laws being imposed by governments with very onerous and strict reporting requirements. So that's FPIA. In contrast, the European Generic Medicines Association, the EGA, well, it's not last month. We're March now, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, Chrissy's nodding. So yes, we're in March now. In January of 2016, the EGA announced disclosure rules that it had included in its most recent code of conduct. Those disclosure rules are similar to FPIA, a little bit different, but in large part mirror what FPIA is doing. Significantly, data collection does not begin for EGA members until 2017, and first reports are due in 2018. That's different than FPIA, where data collection began in 2015 and reports are due for the first time in 2016. Unlike what FPIA did and unlike what EGA did, MedTech Europe, which is comprised of EUCMED, which represents the medical device industry in Europe, as well as the EDMA, which is the European Diagnostic Manufacturers Association, they in December adopted MedTech Europe Code of Conduct, and instead of adopting individual disclosure requirements like FPIA and the EGA, what MedTech Europe did is it decided to come at transparency in a different fashion. In its code, it requires its members to comply with any applicable national laws or anything else that they may have to comply with on the legal side. But they chose to not do individual level reporting requirements like FPIA and the EGA. Instead, they decided the best way to deal with transparency is to eliminate direct sponsorship for HCPs to attend third-party organized events. But that doesn't begin until January 2018. So for the balance of 2016, 2017, med device companies and members of the EDMA can continue to fund those kind of events or participation in those events, but beginning in 2018, that's when it gets phased out. I mentioned there's a couple of laws that was one reason that sort of motivated FPIA to try to come up with an industry code that would prove to governments that self-regulation would work and would be effective in this area. Perhaps the most famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, is France. France adopted a law that applies significantly, and this is important to both pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers. It requires those companies that are covered to report on agreements that they provide. That's on a biannual basis. And it also requires companies to report on agreements that they enter into with HCPs and various other stakeholders. Benefits are reported biannually, but agreements have to be reported within 15 days of signature. So that's a very difficult law in some instances to comply with. And we're not going to spend much time on that, but we did want to point that out. Portugal is another country where there's reporting requirements for the pharmaceutical industry. Denmark is the third flag we have up there. It has reporting requirements that apply to both med device manufacturers as well as pharmaceutical companies. Significantly, the HCPs in Denmark have the obligation to report the financial support that they receive. The obligation on the companies is to annually submit a list of HCPs with whom they've collaborated with and worked with over the past year. So it's a little bit of a different system in Denmark. Again, we're not going to get into the details of all that because we don't have all afternoon to speak to you, but we just want to hit a few highlights on that. A couple other places, Japan, both the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, the Medical Device Association, and the Generic Medicines Industry Group there, they all have self-regulatory reporting requirements. And essentially all three of the Japanese industry groups are identical in terms of what the reporting requirements are. You have to report on 5 different categories. It's an annual report. So that's in place, and that applies to members of those individual industry groups. There's not a law in Japan. The other place that we're just going to highlight quickly is Medicines Australia. This is the pharmaceutical industry group there. It has not, excuse me, had its first reports yet. Their system used to be aggregate reporting. It's moving towards individual level reporting. Data collection under that new system began for members of Medicine Australia in October 2015. First reports are due in August 2016. And Medicines Australia is kind of a Frankenstein monster that kind of combines parts of the U.S. Sunshine Act, parts of France's Sunshine Act, and parts of FPA. So it's a little bit of a hybrid and kind of combines a bunch of different elements. So that's where the main hotspots are for transparency, and maybe later on at the end we can talk about some other places or situations where we might see some more.
Okay, so we're going to go through really some comparisons between the U.S. and FPA. Brian mentioned quite a few other places that have some rules and requirements, and we can maybe later get to some of the nuances there, but we're really going to focus on the FPA side of things. So, jumping right in, one of the major differences, right, that Brian already mentioned is that we have laws in the U.S., right? The state laws initially were the requirements that were out there. And then with the Affordable Care Act and the Sunshine Act, we have obviously a national law that enforces these requirements, that places these requirements on all of the different companies that have to comply. We have, of course, industry codes and industry groups in the U.S. too. Pharma and AdvaMed are very active and have a lot of codes and different compliance guidances that are out there, but they have not ventured into the kind of industry reporting components like FPA has done, which is interesting, and again, like Brian said, it's just different how the European side of things have tried to steer clear of the laws and steer clear of the regulatory space like we have in the U.S. So the definition of recipients, excuse me, who's covered, right, varies lots in the U.S., and we think, obviously, everyone is very focused on the Sunshine Act, so we think a lot about physicians specifically, and then teaching hospitals under the U.S. Sunshine Law, the national law. We, of course, have to remember that at the state level, the laws are broader in most cases. There are other individuals subject to the laws, so physician assistants, nurses, and then other institutions or organizations as well. So non-teaching hospitals, in some cases, medical organizations, third parties, charitable entities, things like that. So definitely a broader base at the state level, but as far as federal reporting in the U.S., we're really limited at that physician and teaching hospital level.
In contrast to the U.S. approach, FBA focuses on HCOs, which are healthcare organizations, and HCPs, which are healthcare professionals. The FBA disclosure code, which we ripped, ripped apart and showed a part of on the lower right-hand side to contrast it to when President Obama signed the Affordable Health Care Act on the left-hand side there. HCOs are defined in the code as a legal person that is a healthcare, medical, or scientific association or organization, like a hospital, a clinic, a foundation, a university, something like that, as well as a corporation or other type of legal body through which a group of HCPs provide services. So that's your definition of HCOs. HCPs are any natural person that's a member of the medical, dental, pharmacy, or nursing professions. It does not include employees of a member company. So if you salaries, things like that, do not have to be disclosed from member companies. But when you're working with an outside consultant, something like that, that's what FBA is defined to include. And I should just mention quickly that we're talking about FBA, and the way FBA works is each of the national member associations have incorporated the FBA code into their own national codes. So the UK has its own code based on the FBA code. Ireland has its own code based on the FBA code. And for the most part, each of the national industry group members of FBA have been consistent in transposing the FBA code. There are a few differences, a few variations. For example, a country might define HCP slightly differently, or an HCO slightly differently depending on the legal status of those organizations in their jurisdiction. So we'll try to point out a few areas where there are some differences, but for the most part, the FBA National Member Associations have transposed things fairly consistently.
Okay. So another sort of significant difference, in some ways at least, is the WHO reports, who's subject to the requirements. And there's certainly some overlap. Here's some we'll get to some statistics, but right in the U.S. we have differences at the state level and then federal level between pharmaceutical companies, specifically medical device companies, sort of at the high level, which entities are subject to which laws. We also can get more detailed than that, right? And at the federal level, we have this definition of applicable manufacturers, and there's, in some ways it seems very clear, but there are pieces that get more granular there. So saying a manufacturer, a distributor, those NDA holders are certainly subject to the law. But then the applicable manufacturer definition also includes affiliated companies that support the manufacture, the distribution, the marketing, the sales of some of these products. So in some corporate relationships, it can be a U.S. company. It can also include non-U.S. companies, companies that are headquartered outside of the U.S. but might have local a local U.S. entity here that is the NDA holder, but is supported by a UK company, a French company, whatever it might be, that is supporting and has interactions with healthcare professionals that might be brought in. The other piece too is the U.S. Sunshine Law applies to companies with at least one FDA approved or cleared product, drug or device, right? So for some companies, they might have a product that is pre-approval. They're still in the research stages, so those companies wouldn't yet be subject to the law. And then similarly, a company that has an approved product, but we get to that next granular level of having it be covered, so having some sort of coverage, reimbursable status under one of the federal and healthcare programs. So there are sort of some nuances there with respect to the federal law here in the U.S. And then some of the state laws even go more granular, talking about having a sales or marketing component as part of the applicability of the law to the company. So there's a lot of nuance to it, but generally we're talking about medical device and pharmaceutical manufacturers.
And for the FBA, as we just pop up some data that we'll go through in a second, for FBA, basically if you're a member of FBA, you have to report, and it kind of encompasses the entirety of your company, your various affiliates, things like that. If you are a member of one of the national industry groups, if you're a member in the UK but not of FBA, you do have to report under the UK code because you're bound to that by virtue of your membership in the UK group. And then in addition to members, we have seen some companies who are not members of FBA or the local industry groups but are active in particular countries. They've chosen to voluntarily report and chosen to voluntarily disclose their information consistent with the FBA reporting system. As you can see here, we have some data for the United States, some of the open payments data from 2014. The Netherlands is interesting. We put that up. The Netherlands industry group is part of FPA, but they sort of have a hybrid where they have had reporting for a couple years now for the pharmaceutical industry, its membership, and you can see they had 41 members and reporting an average of 2,600 euros per HCP. FBA, I mentioned before that there are 40 full members, full corporate members, and in addition there are members of other FBA subgroups that kind of brings the total up to 70 who are bound to comply with the disclosure code. Medicines Australia, there's 38, EGA, there's 36. The good thing about these groups is hopefully you will know if you're a member of one of these groups as you sit in your company. But if you don't and are wondering, you can go to the website of the various groups and they have nice lists of who's on there and who's not. It hasn't been uncommon for us to have interactions with folks who do not realize that they were members of a particular group or have been listed erroneously in some cases. So it's good to know what your company's organizational membership is. And just real quick, as I see the Netherlands up here, I mentioned earlier that the medical device industry group across Europe has chosen to not go down the FBA path of imposing self-regulatory reporting requirements. I should highlight that that's a little bit different in the Netherlands. The Netherlands medical device industry group has imposed some reporting requirements on certain types of manufacturers. Also in Belgium, Belgium's medical device industry group is called Unimec, and they are essentially doing identical reporting to the FBA system. The one significant difference is that their data collection period began in 2016 and their first reports are due in 2017. But for those who are participating in the webinar and have involvement in the medical device side, it's important to be aware that although broadly Europe as an industry is not doing FBA-like reporting, there are pockets where you need to be aware of that and perhaps do some reporting on the med device side.
Great. So always a good question, when do we actually have to deal with all of this stuff? There are various deadlines which keep us on our toes, right? And we'll start at the beginning.
And this is really a test for me to see if I can remember my various flags. So, Chrissy,
and I don't know any of them, so I can't verify if he's telling you the right ones or not.
So we'll run through this as quick as we can. So this first one is January 31, which you probably realize has already passed. That's Denmark. That was the obligation to report. The next one we saw was February, France, for benefits reporting for the last 6 months of 2015. Up next, we have the Netherlands. February 19th, reports were due. If you're a member of the Dutch industry group on the pharma side and some select members of the med device side, February 19th. The next one we're looking at, I think we're familiar with these, the U.S. and the ABPI. The ABPI is a member of FBA, and we'll have FBA pop up in a second because its code requires that reports are due on June 30th. But this is one of those instances I highlighted earlier where the UK group has deviated a little bit. They're requiring their members to have reports into a central registry by March 31st. And that's going to allow them to check the data, notify HCPs, and then ultimately that information will go public on July 1, but companies need to get their data in on March 31st, which is sooner.
And we'll point out that the U.S. theoretically is supposed to be due on the 90th day of the year every year. This year happens to be a leap year, so you actually, CMS is giving us 91 days. So we have a whole extra day to get our data ready and get it submitted.
Next, we have Belgium. Similar to the UK, the Belgian Pharmaceutical Industry Group is requiring its members to submit their data by April 30. It will then become public at the end of June like the rest of FPIA. This is Estonia. For some reason, Estonia is simply 30 days early. Its pharmaceutical industry group that's a member of FPIA is going with June 1st as opposed to June 30th as their deadline. FPIA is June 30th, as we noted before. France, the next round of benefits reporting, the biannual, is due on August 1st. Again, keep in mind agreements have to be done within 15 days of signature. And I mentioned before, the first round of individual level Australian reporting is due on August 31 to cover the period from October 1, 2015 through April 30, 2016. So hopefully I got at least most of these flags right. And I know I got the deadlines right because there's a helpful arrow that points right to the day.
That's right. And then you get the last 4 months of the year off. So, we have a busy first 2/3 of the year and then quiet for the last couple months there. Okay, so going back into some more comparisons, right? So we talked about who's reporting and who we're reporting against. So then we get into the what, right? What are we reporting? Um, the U.S., the Sunshine Law, you guys all probably know, is very broad. It includes research, which is something that we really, besides Vermont, hadn't dealt with at the state level. So the research-related transfers of value and payment disclosure. It also includes the field spend, the small meals, some things that seem fairly innocuous, but meals and educational materials, things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about, but some of those things. We have the commercial medical consulting relationship. So, it's irrespective as to where sort of within the company it comes from. It might be through R&D, might be through medical, commercial, marketing. All of those kinds of things are subject to disclosure. And then at the federal level, something that I struggle with, and I know a lot of you struggle with, is the concept of indirect payments. And this is something that came through, the language of the Sunshine Act, and CMS has provided some guidance on, I'll say. But this concept of working with third parties, right, where we, as a company on the industry side, are making payments to a third party, some vendor or third party agency, and in turn, that agency, that institution is transferring some value, either all of it or some of it, to a covered recipient, namely, usually to a physician. So that idea of an indirect payment is something that we hadn't seen at the state level, is definitely a challenging concept, and I think something that a lot of us are still sort of working through the nuances on some payments that pop up probably this time every year.
My turn to talk about FPIA. So, like Chrissy mentioned, on the direct versus indirect, FPIA has the same type of issue in terms of direct and indirect transfers of value have to be reported, and then there's different treatment depending on HCOs and HCPs. For HCOs, companies have to report on donations and grants that they give to such organizations, as well as contributions to costs that are related to events. So things like registration fees or sponsorship agreements with HCOs, travel and accommodation, those type of things have to be reported. And the third category of transfer of value that gets reported for HCOs is fees for services and consultancy, both fees and expenses. And then for HCPs, they're the exact same categories, except donations and grants are not reportable because they are not permissible. You do not report anything like that. Instead, you simply report on, for HCPs, contributions to costs related to events and the consultancy fees and expenses.
So Research I mentioned on the U.S. side, right? Something that we really hadn't had to deal with much at the state level. When that came through with the federal law here, um, I think thankfully CMS recognized that there are some nuances, right? That the way research-related payments occur, and particularly in the true clinical study, clinical trial arena, the way those happen, it's not akin to your kind of standard consulting payment or lunch or something like that. So in the US, we have a unique template, right, that we use specifically for research payments, and it's pretty sophisticated. It has an awful lot of data elements on it, but it essentially allows us to say we're making a payment to an entity, typically an institution, a hospital, a research site of some kind. And also, there is a physician or some principal investigator involved with the study. So, what's supposed to be happening, and I know probably a lot of you had some disputes or inquiries last year about this, but it's supposed to be essentially saying we recognize that the physician principal investigator isn't receiving all of these funds, right? It's not $100,000 to Dr. Jones for participating in research. It's really $100,000 went to the University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Jones is the physician who is acting as the principal investigator associated with that research. So it's very nuanced. I think really it is a good thing how we report it a little bit differently, but the template um, is is very specific and is challenging, and it is totally separate. So we are separating that research data fully from all of the non-research data, I'll say.
And for FBA, research is treated as one big aggregate number per country. So essentially, all the transfers of value that a member company makes for a particular jurisdiction relating to R&D, non-clinical studies as defined by the OECD, clinical trials, non-interventional studies that are prospective in nature, companies can simply roll everything up, all related costs, expenses with that, and that gets reported as one single number on the reporting template per year.
So spend thresholds is something in the U.S. we've dealt with for a long time. A couple of the states have their own thresholds. We know Vermont has none, but Massachusetts has a hefty $50 reporting threshold. D.C. has a $25 threshold. Um, Again, I guess the Sunshine Act had to be a little unique, so we have a special situation there. When the law was passed originally, we had this 10, $100 threshold, right? This idea that you don't have to report anything under $10 unless the aggregate total for that particular covered recipient exceeds $100 in a given year. Then, in that case, you have to report everything related to that person, whether it was above or below that $10 threshold. Um, and to further complicate things, maybe the government recognized that we have inflation and just changes in currency and everything and the value, and so we have this rule that each year that 10 and $100 changes a little bit in connection with the consumer price index. So for this year, for 2016 data, our thresholds are a whopping $10.22 and $102.19. So if you have a system, hopefully all of that is being managed systematically, but from a looking at your data manually, it's just sort of this annoying nuance of having to look to the penny as opposed to just that simple 10 and $100.
So in the world of FBA, there are no spend thresholds. You don't have to hit a number to trigger your reporting obligation once you're a member company, and once you spend in one of the reportable categories, that's good, and you just have to report that. You don't have to worry about hitting a spend threshold. I should just point out that the Netherlands, which I mentioned is a little bit different, they do have a threshold, €500. Then in places like France, where there's a law, there is a €10 threshold for the reporting of benefits. Portugal, I mentioned, has a spend threshold of €60, but largely under FBA, no spend threshold to worry about. Don't have to worry about pennies or anything like that.
So a little more detail, right? The nature that we're reporting. A lot of you are familiar with the categories on the U.S. side. For our spend purpose, we have 15 different categories. Thinking about consulting, charitable contributions, grants, travel, things like that. And then at the nature level, thinking about sort of how that payment gets made, the form of the payment, thinking in terms of was it cash or the cash equivalent, a check of some kind, was it an in-kind item or service potentially, and then in the U.S. we have the very tricky and nuanced requirements related to reporting ownership or equity interests and payments. So thinking about dividends, options, things like that. So some different categories there in terms of what we're actually reporting.
Those are all largely things that we don't have to think about under FBA. One of the benefits of self-regulation, as opposed to having an external law imposed upon you, is you kind of get to set up what you want to report and how you want to report it. So nature, things like that, do not have to be specified and drilled down to the level like we see in the U.S. Instead, we'll show you the template in a few slides here. You just have to allocate whatever the spend is to the appropriate category, as I mentioned before what the categories were, and that's it.
All right. And last one on this slide, I think, thinking about this concept, in the U.S., this is really not something we deal with. We report individual line items, right? Every single transaction, every payment that occurs, we report it as a line item. There are exceptions in Massachusetts, right? We do some aggregating there. And then on the research template that I talked about, the research payments report, you can do a little bit of aggregating at the site level, I'll say. So payments to a site with the same PI and the same nature, if it were all cash equivalents, you could roll those up. But otherwise, we're not reporting at the event level.
In FBA, we do not have to worry about reporting by event, reporting each and every individual transaction or interaction that you might have with a given HCP or HCO. Instead, you get to report all of your interactions as one single number. So if you have 100 interactions with a particular HCP, you just report what the sum total of all those interactions were. You don't have to list all 100. Same thing with HCOs. The one distinction I would point out, as I mentioned again early on, some of the national groups are a little bit different. In the UK, the ABPI is the industry group there. They require that HCOs report per transaction, but other than that, under FBA, you only have to report one number per year per HCP or per HCO. Again, one of the benefits of self-regulation. You get to set up a system that's fairly beneficial to your members.
All right, so a good question. Are there templates? How is this reporting situation actually happening? For those of you familiar with the U.S. side, I mentioned with respect to research, but it's true across the board that we have very sophisticated templates. We have what they call it a crosswalk that have very detailed specifications about the data elements that have to be included for the general payments report, the research payments report, and then the ownership and investment interest report. It goes field by field as far as what's required and what's optional, what format the data must come in, if there are any length limits, as to character limits, any specifics as to what kinds of characters, whether it's text or numerical only. There are some conditional requirements. If you say yes in field 22, then field 23 becomes required. So a lot of very specific rules associated with the Sunshine Act reporting. This has been an ongoing challenge, I think, for a lot of companies because CMS has, I think, been improving the process, but sort of each year of reporting, the validation rules have changed a little bit. So working with these templates while I think it's good that we're all reporting in a similar, consistent fashion, the templates themselves are very complicated. Of course, we have templates on the state level too, which are each unique and have their own special requirements. They're not quite as sophisticated or as involved as the open payments templates. And then the validation associated with them is a little bit different too. I'll say that Vermont's validation is pretty intense, but beyond that, it's not quite as sophisticated as the Sunshine Act.
And now we can get a look at the FPA template. As you can see, perhaps you can see, depending on how close you are to your screen, on the left-hand side, you have your HCPs and HCOs, and you have rows where you list them, and then we have the columns of the information, the various categories that I mentioned before in terms of contributions to events and fees for service and consultancy. Way down at the bottom, you can perhaps see the bottom row is for R&D, and as you can see, you just go all the way across to your right, put in total amount, and that's the total amount for the R&D spend in that particular jurisdiction. One thing that I would kind of highlight, the national industry groups have been fairly consistent in utilizing this type of FPA template. There are a few differences, and the one I'll just note is you might be able to see there's a column unique country identifier, which is optional on the FPA template. There are some countries like Spain, the Netherlands, where that is required. So it's important to know in a particular country, are you going to need a UCI, and then you have to be able to provide that as part of your report in that jurisdiction.
Okay. All right, so some more comparisons here. You can see some good all-American things on the left there, and their exciting European compatriots.
As a Jets fan, I might quibble with the idea that the Jets are good or a good experience for anyone who roots for them. But.
Fair enough, fair enough. Language, right? So this is something in the U.S. has not been an issue. We are, reporting everything we report at the state and federal level only in English.
It's a bit more of a challenge outside the U.S. The FBA code says that the reports have to be done in the local language and English is encouraged. From that, the industry groups have taken a wide variety of approaches. Some say report in both the local language and English, where both are required. Russia is an example where we see that. Some say local language only. Some say local language and English is encouraged. Then you kind of get a few ones that are a bit idiosyncratic. Switzerland says the report has to be in English, and if you have time, please also submit it in French, German, and Italian. So it's important to figure out for each country what language do you have to report it in. And then obviously if you're working in the U.S., working with one of your affiliates somewhere where the language is not English, you're going to have to be able to share all that data, be able to get the data in the appropriate spots and have it reproduced in the report in the language that is consistent with what the code requires.
So where are we reporting? We talked about the who and the what and the how. The where is important too. For the U.S. Sunshine Act, you are probably all, especially right now, very familiar with the Open Payments website. It's a pretty, again, sophisticated system, requires all kinds of login credentials. There's some vetting that happens with respect to the company and to your officials that are associated with the registration. So we are submitting these sophisticated reports, like we just looked at the templates, directly into the Open Payments website. At the state level, some differences there. We're uploading an access database for Vermont, and then beyond that, we're sending in the appropriate form via email. So a little bit different there.
The FBA disclosure code says that reports have to be placed either on the company's website or a central registry if one is developed in that particular country. So it's an either or, and we've seen national member groups take different approaches. Some places like the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Belgium have developed a central registry where companies have to submit their reports to it. Other countries like Switzerland, like Spain, like Germany, companies only have to place the report on their company website. So again, that's another area where we see some variations, and companies need to know where they have to put the report and to be able to produce it in a way that satisfies the central registry or to be able to place it on your website.
Exceptions, always good. We like to have things that are exempted out of the requirements, right? At the federal level in the U.S., there aren't that many, to be honest. We talked about the threshold, right? So in some cases, things less than $10 or $10 and change will be exempted, depending on that $100 threshold there. Um, One of the things that is exempted from the Sunshine Report is product samples, right? So thinking about medical devices or pharmaceutical samples that companies give out. But I want to note that those things are subject to disclosure through a separate section of the Affordable Care Act, right? Drug samples are. So that's something that you're not reporting to open payments, but you potentially are reporting separately. Another sort of big one to note, I'll say, is the idea related to educational materials. And the law specifically exempts educational materials that directly benefit or are intended for patients. So thinking about things that you might bring to a hospital or a physician's office that are directly intended to go to a patient or to be used in office with the patient, those kinds of things would be exempted, excluded from the reporting requirements. But CMS has been clear that educational materials that benefit the physician, that are intended really for the physician's use, while great and important for educational purposes, those are not included in that exemption. So things like reprints, right, we currently have to report, and there's some potential that those things will be removed or excluded down the line, but for now they are still included. There's some other things that may come up for medical device companies. The idea of giving a device out for a loan, a trial period, less than 90 days, or 90 days or less, those are excluded. In-kind items given to a teaching hospital, for example, that are provided specifically for charity care, those would be exempted. So there are some exceptions, but really the reporting at the federal level in the U.S. is quite broad, and there are not many exemptions.
FBA has some specified exceptions. First, transfers of value that are solely related to over-the-counter medicines. Second, items of medical utility. Third, and this is a huge difference from the U.S., meals and drinks. Those are not reported under the FBA system. And then the last broad category of exception is transfers of value that are part of an ordinary purchase and sale of a product between a member company and an HCP or an HCO. So it's a little bit different than the U.S. in terms of what the exceptions are. And I think our next slide is meals, not slide, bullet, flag, check mark, whatever it is. For meals, not reportable under the FBA system. Instead, FBA decided rather than have to have all those fights about how much the hot dog, hamburger, cheeseburger, chicken was and whether the HCP actually ate it, instead, we won't report those. What we'll do is we'll have each national member association set a maximum threshold above which a company cannot spend on an HCP. So each of the FBA national members has determined how much would be appropriate for a company to spend on a meal. And they're all different, so companies need to be aware of what they are across the breadth of Europe, but they don't have to be reported. The idea is if you go above that threshold, you're in violation of the code, and you'll be penalized in some fashion, and if you're below it, that's perfect, that's fine, doesn't have to be reported. So that's a significant difference, and much less of an administrative burden in terms of tracking for reporting purposes on the meals in Europe.
So the review and dispute process in the U.S. is uh, sophisticated, I'll say, in that it is required by the law. It's part of the open payments program. CMS has put in place a functionality to facilitate it, and then certainly a process associated with it. We have some companies that sort of go a step further and do communicate in advance of reporting generally with the physicians to try and have that conversation ahead of time to review the data to get feedback on whether anything looks amiss or might not be accurate. I'll say that we had less attention from the physicians than I think a lot of us thought we would have as far as the dispute process goes. Every company seems to have one physician that really hones in and tends to object to everything. But generally speaking, I think we had had less attention, less diligence from the physicians than we expected to have. But that process is in place, and it's built into the timeline and everything associated with Sunshine Act reporting.
Very different under FBA. FBA does not have, as part of its code, any type of formal review and dispute process. A few countries, like the UK and the Netherlands, I feel like I keep saying those two, but those are two that have done it, do have a review and dispute period before the information goes public, but it's not part of the FBA code, not a requirement of the code. FBA has put out FAQs for its disclosure code, where it says, hey, member companies, probably a good idea for you to check in with your HCPs before publishing this information. There could be a lag time between when the spend was, when consent was given, which we'll talk about in a moment, and when the information becomes public. But that's part of essentially your HCP management plan. You do not have to go through any review and dispute process under the FBA code itself.
So this sort of goes into more of that, right? This idea of assumptions, and Brian will talk about the methodology. In the U.S., we have the law included requirements or options related to maintaining and submitting an assumptions document. It's voluntary. It was never required for reporting. And when CMS developed the Open Payments Program and the portal, it turned out that, in fact, it's not really a document that they're looking for, but we can enter sort of free text, right? Some information about the submission or about our assumptions associated with the process. I'll say that a lot of companies choose not to include anything as part of their submission. Some companies do include some information, but because of character limits and not being able to really do any formatting at all, kind of keep it at a minimal level. I will say that we think in maintaining an assumptions document or just some kind of internal assumptions, interpretations, things like that is important, certainly from an audit or an investigation perspective, if the government did come knocking, but also really just to memorialize the decisions you're making, the interpretations that you're making so that you can be consistent year over year and sort of remember what you did, 10 months ago when it comes back to reporting again. So, in the U.S., the assumptions document is something that we recommend, but it's not required.
FBA is very different. The FBA code has a provision that requires companies to publish what's called a methodology note. And in that note, companies are supposed to describe how they went about preparing their disclosures and identifying their transfers of value, how they dealt with things like the value-added tax, multi-year contracts, currency, various things along those lines. So it's mandatory that companies do that. Another big difference from the U.S., it's public. It is not hidden. It's part of essentially your disclosure, and also there are no character limits. And the methodology document can be helpful for companies because it provides an opportunity to explain and justify various decisions that it made. The FBA Disclosure Code FAQs that I mentioned, there's a lot of gray area in this code, especially since this is its first time. And there's a whole bunch of questions where FBA says, that's a really good question. We don't really have an answer, so why don't you guys go figure it out and explain what you did in your methodology note. So the methodology note, again, companies can be as detailed or as general as they like while addressing those various issues. And I think it'll be very interesting to see what companies do. Then companies will be able to see what each other did after all this information becomes public. And then perhaps there will be kind of a coalescing around various approaches so that there's a more consistent approach across the board to some of these gray areas. Consent is a huge issue in the EU, and now we're really going to look at the intersection between industry code and data protection law. Consent is not an issue in the U.S., but under the FBA system, because it's an industry code, it does not have the force of law. And because of the strong data protection rights that are afforded to EU citizens under both EU and national member law, for all intents and purposes, companies have to get the consent of an HCP to report a transfer value to that HCP at the individual level. Effectively, the company has to say to Dr. Smith, we are giving you 100,000 euros part of this consulting agreement. Do we have your consent to publicly disclose this information? And Dr. Smith can say yes, in which case the company will list Dr. Smith and the pertinent information about him or her and list 100,000 euros. And if Dr. Smith has the right to say, no, I don't want that information disclosed. In that case, what the company has to do is take all of the individuals in the particular country who said no and aggregate that, report as an aggregate number, the HCPs that chose to not consent, then the aggregate amount that they spent on those HCPs. So it's hugely important for companies to be able to effectively get consent from HCPs and then be able to track it, because not only do HCPs have the right to say yes or no in the first instance, they also have the right to revoke their consent. And when they revoke their consent is very important, because if the HCP revokes his or her consent before the information becomes public, most companies have taken the position under the national data protection laws that they then have to move that over into the aggregate category and they cannot publicly disclose it. It's a little bit different if the HCP consents and then after the information becomes public, then he or she says, oh my gosh, I don't want that information out there. Please pull that down. In that case, companies have to look at the data protection law to see if a revocation of consent in that particular country can have retroactive effect. And even if they're not required to, some companies might want to pull that down. If it's an important HCP, a KOL who does not want his or her name out there, even though it's already out there on the internet. But, as part of their KOL management, they might want to take that down. Now, you may be asking yourself, why would an HCP ever consent? Why would they want this information out there? Well, they might not want that information out there, but what the pharmaceutical companies and FDA have been trying to do is encourage HCPs to participate in this and give their individual level consent. Because frankly, this whole idea of transparency is not going away. And if this FDA system fails, what we're probably going to see more governments come in with more laws, different laws, more burdensome laws. And in some instances, like we see in Denmark, like we see to some degree in Portugal, the HCPs themselves might be the ones that have to do the actual financial reporting. So it's very important at this time for the pharmaceutical companies to try to work with their HCPs to get the HCPs to buy into this system, and then by working together and by trying to be transparent as much as possible at the individual level, then they can go to government and say, look, the pharmaceutical industry has aggressively dealt with this issue, and we don't need governmental regulation on this because we have very high consent rates. We have a lot of individual level information. If that is not the case in particular countries or more broadly across Europe, we're probably going to see more laws. And although the medical device industry for the most part is not participating in the FBA system, except for those couple countries I mentioned, Netherlands and Belgium, if FBA fails and doesn't satisfy governments, we're probably going to see governments come in and not confine their legislation to just the pharmaceutical industry. It'll probably apply to the medical device industry as well. France is an excellent example of that. The French law was essentially caused by a scandal involving some health risks associated with the drug in the pharmaceutical sector. The government came in and said, we're going to clean up, quote unquote, clean up this entire area. We're going to have financial transparency, and we're going to impose it on both pharmaceutical and medical device and a whole bunch of other folks too. So it's important for the medical device community to monitor how FBA does, and will it satisfy governments that they don't need to come in and pass their own laws, because we're not going to see less transparency over time. We're only going to see more. And it's important for both sides, really, obviously pharmaceutical at the threshold level to the extent they have to do reporting, to try to get the HCPs to buy in, to come up with a system that really works and is truly transparent. And I should just, excuse me, also note that although I was focused on HCPs, it's important for companies who are doing reporting under FBA to look at the national data protection law that they're focused on, because in a few countries across Europe, Austria, Switzerland, the data protection rights extend to legal persons. So in those countries, companies actually have to get consent from HCOs. Most countries in Europe, data protection only applies to natural persons, your HCPs. You only need to get consent from HCPs. But there's a few where you have to get consent from HCOs. All the same considerations apply. Being able to get that consent, track it, and ensure that's reported accurately is hugely important, especially because if a company violates data protection laws, if you publish information when an HCP is actually not given his or her consent, that can lead to fairly severe sanctions under the national data protection laws, from fines, both administrative, criminal. In some terribly egregious cases, there could be significant fines, possible imprisonment. So complying with the data protection laws while also satisfying the disclosure requirements is an enormous obligation and an important consideration for pharmaceutical companies participating in the FBA scheme to be aware of. I feel like I just gave a speech as Chrissy looks at me, but all right, we'll see what's next.
The consent piece is really important. It's something, like you said, that is not an issue in the U.S. We have some indignant physicians that are unhappy that their data is out there, but they don't have the same protection that Europe does give its citizens. So we're bumping up against 2 o'clock. Just want to be mindful of the time. We have, one more slide after this, so just a couple more things to cover, and then, we'll circle back after the webinar to anyone who submitted questions. So hang in with us for just a few more minutes if you can. Okay. So the attestation piece, a lot of you know in the U.S. we have a requirement that the data that's submitted under the Sunshine Act is attested to. It has to be timely. It has to be complete. It has to be accurate. This attestation has to happen from an officer of the company who has to be registered in open payments, who have to be vetted. There's a whole formal process for that. So it's very sophisticated and it's very thorough, and there is that attestation component to the data submission process.
There is no such requirement under FBO.
Excellent. Okay. Last piece here, penalties, just something to be mindful of course, in the U.S. at the state level and then at the federal level. All of the laws, I think, come with their own penalties. At the federal level in the U.S., we're dealing with civil monetary penalties that range from a failure to submit at the $1,000 to $10,000 per payment, up to a max of $150,000 per year. However, if the government decides that you knowingly failed to submit data, so it was more of an intentional failure, those penalties jump up to between $10,000 and $100,000 per failure, with a cap of potential $1 million a year. So some very big potential enforcement there. We have not seen it yet at the federal level. CMS has said that they could enforce, so we have to be mindful of that, but the program is still relatively new, so they haven't been, really going after people from a penalty perspective just yet.
Under FBA, each national member association gets to include in its code sanctions. The national member groups have chosen sanctions along the lines of a reprimand, a written warning, to monetary sanctions, which can be incredibly insignificant to fairly significant. Personally, I would be surprised if the national member groups are terribly aggressive in imposing significant penalties on its members, especially those who try to comply in good faith with reporting requirements. But there are provisions there, and we'll see what the first round of reporting brings, but I think everyone would be surprised if industry groups went too aggressively after their own members.
Okay. All right, so just a little chatter here on sort of the U.S. experience and how that sort of applies more broadly. I'll let Brian dive into this one.
Yeah, kind of the whole approach of as you start to expand around the world or as you become more involved in more industry groups and start to face additional reporting requirements and just frankly doing business in more and more places, the idea is what kind of approach are you going to take? Are you going to try to have a global structure where everybody tries to comply with the same, and I'm just going to use this phrase, type of cookie cutter approach? You'll have a global ag spend policy. Or is it going to be more regional? Are you going to have kind of the European approach versus the Australian approach versus the Asian approach? Again, transparency-wise, there's not a ton of reporting requirements right now in Asia, none in South America, Africa. Over time, we'll probably get there. But as we're thinking long term, are you going to set it up on a regional basis? Or are you going to go country by country? And each country is going to kind of do their own thing. That in and of itself can pose lots of challenges because we have to share information, and that's very important. So, what kind of policies do you want to set up? What kind of procedures? Are you going to do it globally, locally, regionally? Important considerations to think about, especially on the sharing information front, because you're going to have your affiliates in different places interacting with different types of HCPs and then having to report different ways, different places. So, an example could be if you're a member of FPIA with U.S. headquarters and you're sponsoring a Swedish HCP to attend or participate in an activity in Germany. Where does that information get reported? Well, even though you're a U.S. company, you're a member of FBA, and therefore you're bound by the FBA code, so you know you have to comply with the FBA code. Now you have to figure out which country do I do the reporting in. The event took place in Germany. It was a Swedish doctor. Under the FBA code, you have to report based on where the recipient is. So in this case, you need to be able to report that in Sweden. Now, do you have a Swedish affiliate? If so, are you the one doing the reporting? Is your Swedish affiliate doing the reporting? Is the Swedish affiliate the one who owns the relationship with the HCP and is thereby responsible for getting the consent and tracking the consent and those kind of things? So you're going to be sharing information all across borders and different situations. Another kind of hypothetical is a Spanish company that's a member of FBA is sponsoring a U.S. doctor to participate in an event in Ireland. Well, in that case, the FBA membership doesn't matter because you're working with a U.S. doctor. Now, you'll have to go back and figure out, are you an applicable manufacturer under the Open Payments Act, and whereby you might have to report it in the U.S. But the point is, and Chrissy and I have spent lots of time sitting in rooms staring at each other and other people coming up with these crazy scenarios of how companies are going to be able to share this information, get it to the right place. So these are all things you can come up with all sorts of convoluted scenarios of different affiliates sharing information, owning relationships with doctors of different nationalities with multiple office locations. So being able to track that, figure out what the relationship is, and if it has to be reported, how it gets reported, getting the information to the right place, that's a hugely important aspect of companies as they start to become more global and encounter more of these type of reporting requirements.
So we'll loop these two together a little bit just because, like we said on the US side, we're really not dealing with consent, but the concept of having good relationships with your customers, with your HCPs, right, is applicable anywhere, right? And you want to make sure that your whether it's headquarters folks or your field teams are able to have good relationships, good conversations, to have access, to be able to interact in a positive way. So maintaining these relationships, whether we're required to get consent or not, has been really important. From the U.S. side, we've seen through the dispute process, like I said, not a ton of disputes, but this idea that when a physician is disputing their data, it's not just yes or no, it's right, it's wrong, but having a conversation with them so that they understand sort of what our obligations are, what our responsibilities are, why we're reporting it the way we're reporting it, sort of being transparent and open and trying to have them buy into the idea, and while they might not be enthusiastic about having this data reported or published, having them know and hopefully believe that you are sensitive to it and you understand where they're coming from. So having that conversation, can happen in a lot of different ways, but just as part of the HCP management process, making sure that the HCPs, physicians, whoever it might be, making sure that they feel like you care about the data, care about their perspective, and like Brian said, certainly with respect to consent, asking for consent is one thing, but having the conversation to encourage consent, and to buy into the program so that there is more individual reporting, so that hopefully this doesn't bloom and explode, I guess, into a divergent and regulatory-based requirement throughout Europe, is really important. And different companies are choosing to do that in a lot of different ways, and I think that will evolve a lot over the next handful of years, probably.
Absolutely, and being able to document that consent trail, to be able to document the interactions that you had with the HCP so that if there is an informal dispute, you'll be able to pull up what you need and be able to interact with the HCP in that way. And also, I think we have a quick check mark about data analytics in a sense. This is all kind of rolled into that too. By having to report so much information, you're going to have to be able to organize it, collect it, which you're probably doing in many ways already. But by being able to group data in different ways, you'll be able to leverage the internal resources that you have to be able to figure out, oh, wow, this is what we're actually spending on Dr. Smith by different affiliates throughout the world, or being able to get a better sense of the relationships with HCPs. And you'll be able to use this data not only for reporting purposes, but to be able to monitor uh, your HCP relationships, manage those a little bit better, kind of ensure a more efficient engagement process with HCPs, and be able to basically just become more effective. And then we have the data analytics in terms of what we see in the open payments. You can go in and see what other companies are spending, what your competitors are spending, what they're spending on particular HCPs. It's a little bit different than the U.S. because we talked about the consent issue. If a doctor says, they don't consent, you're not going to be able to see what they're actually receiving from different companies. There could be other reasons why an individual does not pop up. Uh, if they're doing R&D work, you're not going to know how much is being spent that way. But the data analytics, both in terms of from internally understanding what the company is doing on a more global basis, this provides an opportunity to do that, as well as being able to compare yourself to your competitors in the marketplace, see how they're engaging the same folks you are, to be able to get a better sense of how you can more efficiently utilize your own resources. Also, in terms of lessons learned, we just put this up here. To the extent that you made certain reporting decisions in the U.S., probably not a good idea to be wildly inconsistent when you're encountering the same issue outside the U.S. Medical publications is an example where it's not a clear-cut black and white, either under open payments or under FPA. So if you do choose to report something under the U.S. and you choose to do something opposite ex-U.S., that could be a problem. That goes back to the kind of first check mark here. What kind of approach are you taking, global, regional, or local? Whatever approach it is, you need to align on certain key fundamental points to ensure some level of consistency, because you don't want to be taking different approaches, because to the extent that an industry group, law enforcement authority, someone starts taking a look at all this data that's out there, you want to be consistent in your approach. So in terms of lessons learned, there's a whole bunch of lessons that can be learned, but seeing the time that we're running short on, I thought we would just highlight that point.
I think that's great. Yeah, yeah. The other one that I'll just mention is that it takes longer than anticipated. We know on the U.S. side that um, this seems so simple. There's just data. You pull it all together and you get it out into the to the report. You submit it however it needs to be submitted, and it just is much more complicated. And the data is never as healthy as we want it to be. And this idea of cooperation, right, and getting data from third parties or getting data from other internal departments, on now at the FPA level, you're expanding that to getting data from different countries and different affiliates, and the concept of cooperation and sort of who owns what, who's responsible for what, is humongous. And I think just really being cognizant of that, and as you're deciding sort of on your structure, like we said, the global versus regional versus local, really taking the time to develop that ownership structure so that everybody knows what their responsibilities are and what the timeline is, and trying to stick to that as much as possible, and setting it out at the outset, I think, is a really great way to sort of start the program and start things out on the right foot. So I think we'll stop there. We appreciate you guys sticking with us over time. We have a couple questions that I see came in, and we won't forget about them. We'll be sure to touch base individually with each of you. We have your email addresses from your registration, so we'll connect with you. And for those of you that requested slides, we'll get those to you too. Like I said, the webinar will be recorded and put on our website, so if you wanted to share it with anyone, please feel free to do so, or reach out to us and let us know if there are other questions, or if we can get on the phone and chat with you and talk about some unique situations that you have, or anything special in your particular company. So thank you again. We appreciate you joining us, and we hope it was a helpful session. Thank you.